Has anyone heard about Islam lately? I love that. I ask that all the time. Actually, you probably haven't heard as much about Islam as you think you have. You understand it, and so when you hear things going on in the world and Muslim countries, all of this murder and mayhem and violent religious bigotry and anti-Semitism and anti-Christianism and homophobia, suppression of women, and the most cruel and sadistic type of murders that they keep thinking up all the time, all done in the name of Islam by religious Muslims, and they quote their sacred texts in order to support this. But of course, that is not reported by the media. We know it's Islam, but they don't, or at least they're not telling us. And so what we want to do tonight is I want to do two things. I want to explain to you in sort of a nutshell the logic of Islam, and so that you can then take this knowledge and give it to others. Because, folks, we are losing the war, and we're losing it because we don't have enough people on our side. And this is kind of strange. You would think it'd be natural, given the nature of Islam and the nature of America, that we should have a natural reaction. Everybody in the United States should have a natural reaction against Islam, pretty much like we had against communism, only even worse. But it's not happening. And what I want to do tonight is show why it's not happening, and then when you understand why it's not happening, you can use that knowledge to talk to others, because we've got to get other people on our side. And so I want to explain to you the logic of Islam in a way that you can explain it to others, and then I want to motivate you to explain it to others. When you go home tonight, if you don't tell other people and share with them what you're learning tonight, if you don't do that, we're going to lose. We have to become active. Consider yourself in a way to be missionaries. You have to go spread our message. Because if nobody spreads the message, it's not going to get spread. And the media is against us. And of course, to the extent that the Muslims have control of the media, and they do, they are against us. They don't want the message spread either. So please, definitely go out and spread the message to others. It is crucially important to do that. And I'll explain some ways that you can do that at the end. Now, logic. I entitled this The Logic of Islam. When I told one of our activist friends from New York that this was the title of my talk, he said, "Logic? There is no logic in Islam." But he's wrong. There is. There is a logic in Islam, and both Muslims and non-Muslims are imprisoned by it. They can't break that logic. If you believe in Islam, you can't defeat the logic. And that's what we need to understand and to get other people to understand. Now the question is, why don't people understand this? Well, there are barriers, linguistic barriers, semantic barriers that prevent them from understanding it, and I want to deal with those tonight especially. We need semantic clarity. You know, there was a philosopher of science, I don't know whether you remember his name or maybe you never heard of him, Hans Reichenbach, wrote an excellent book called The Rise of Scientific Philosophy. And on the very first page, he says something really very profound, that the analysis of error begins with the analysis of language. And the reason is that we perceive reality through words. And if we don't have a clear definition of the words, if the words are fuzzy, our perception of reality is fuzzy. And I believe that that is what is going on and why we are unable to communicate our message as we should communicate it to the rest of our fellow citizens. The first major misunderstanding when it comes to dealing with Islam is the word Islam. Now, you all know that it means submission, but we're not talking about the etymological definition. Islam is usually taken to mean one or more of many things. It could be the history of Muslims in Islamic countries. It could be the various cultures in the world of Islam. It's the way Muslims behave. But first and foremost, we need to consider Islam to be the Quran and Muhammad. It's that simple. It's the belief system. And the problem with understanding that people have is that they confuse the belief system with people, Muslims. Muslims can behave in any which way, but the belief system does not change. And so when we talk about Islam, and we need to get this to other people when we talk about them, is that Islam, when we say Islam, we mean the Quran and Muhammad. And that's it. And this has very serious consequences in the sense, the following sense. Well, first let me back up just a second. You're all perhaps familiar with certain moderate Muslims like Tariq Fatah, right? He came out with a statement in an article not long ago. He says, the title of his article was, "Here's the Real War Within Islam." What did he mean by that? When he uses the word Islam, he's not talking about the Quran and Muhammad. There is no war about that, unfortunately. He's talking about the world of Islam. There are Muslims who are against and for jihadism, but he, like other moderate Muslims, never talk about the Quran and Muhammad. And there's, of course, the celebrity moderate Muslim everybody knows, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who wrote his autobiography entitled Battle for the Soul of Islam. Now, he didn't mean battle for the soul of the Quran and Muhammad. He never talks about the Quran and Muhammad. He's talking about Muslims as people. Some are violent and some are not violent. So he's also conflating the belief system with the people. We need to stop doing that. We need to talk only about the belief system. And the reason why that is so important is because it's the belief system that is taught in all of the mosques. So the belief system will always produce a great number of Muslims who take it seriously. And that's why we have to, when we talk about Islam, let everybody know that what you're really talking about is the Quran and Muhammad. Now, everybody knows that there are moderate Muslims, obviously, but there is no such thing as moderate Islam. And we need to make that clear to people also. Islam is the Quran and Muhammad, and it cannot be either moderate or immoderate. In fact, there's this very famous saying by Erdogan from Turkey, who said there's no such thing as moderate Islam, that the very concept is ugly. Islam cannot be either moderate or immoderate. It is what it is. Islam is Islam, and that's it. Well, this is one of the strongest leaders, Muslim leaders in the world. He knows what he's talking about. What is he referring to when he says Islam can be neither moderate nor immoderate? Well, he's obviously referring to the Quran and Muhammad, the belief system. He didn't say so, but that's it. Because Muslims as people, they can be moderate, they can be peaceful, but those are the ones who are not following the Quran and Muhammad. There's another quotation by a former leader of the Council on American Islamic Relations, Bassem Khafagi, who said, "I was the first to expose the notion of so-called moderate Islam," he put it in quotes, which is used as a means to canonize a non-Islamic Islam. Now get that, a non-Islamic Islam. What in the world is that? Well, what he's talking about with Islamic, he means the Quran and Muhammad. And so a non-Islamic Islam would be Muslims who practice Islam without following the directives in the Quran and Muhammad. That's what he's talking about. And so he says this so-called moderation means a violation of the laws of Islam. So that is pretty clear. He's talking about the belief system. And that's why when we talk to people, we have to be very clear that we're talking about the belief system and not how Muslims behave or don't behave. Now, moderate Islam then is really nothing more than a deviation from Islam, Islam being the Quran and Muhammad. You're all familiar with Bosch Fawston, I assume. He's the cartoonist who won the prize in the Draw Muhammad cartoon contest. He came out with a very good statement the other day. He said that moderate Muslims, the main thing that otherwise impotent moderate Muslims do for Islam is that they discourage otherwise honest and knowledgeable people from condemning Islam. Again, Islam being the Quran and Muhammad. And so these moderate Muslims create false hopes in people that they represent a viable form of Islam, the belief system, when they don't even talk about the belief system. And of course, they don't represent any viable form at all. They are, in fact, rejected by their Muslim communities. Both Tariq Fatah and Zuhdi Jasser have told us that they have no support in the Muslim communities, because what they are vaguely advocating, without actually saying it specifically, is a reform of the Quran and Muhammad, and of course they can't do that. And in fact, I remember a debate that Dr. Jasser had with the imam of a mosque in Tempe, and it started out where the imam asked Dr. Jasser, do you believe that the Quran is Allah's literal word? And Jasser said, yes, of course. That was the end of the debate. There's nothing more to debate after that. If you're not going to question the Quran, there's nothing more to debate. Now, if you turn to page 2 in your handout for a moment, let's talk about that. You see a triangle. It's kind of a schematic version, how to divide up the Muslim community. This is the version that we are all given by the media. At the top, you've got this tiny minority of violent extremists, as they're called, and that, of course, includes those organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria, the Taliban, and so on. And then, presumably, everybody else below that tip of the triangle, everybody else is presumably moderate, because they're not going around blowing people up, shooting them and cutting their heads off and immolating them and crucifying them and what else. And so people who don't do that are considered to be moderates by the ignorant non-Muslims. The problem with that politically correct division of the Muslim community, we will then see on page 3. You look at the diagram on page 3. Considering all of these non- or unviolent Muslims to be moderate blinds us to the hundreds of millions of Muslims who share the same goals as the violent extremists, namely the establishment of a worldwide Islamic empire called the Caliphate. Same goals. Their methods of going about it are different, depending on the conditions. The Muslims, as minorities in non-Muslim countries, cannot afford to be violent because they would be crushed. And so they go about their subversive actions, infiltrating the institutions. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this is what we have to get across to people, that these so-called moderate Muslims are not moderate at all, the ones that they think are moderate, simply because they're not cutting people's heads off. The entire Muslim Brotherhood is the middle part of the triangle, but they are as aggressive, just not as violent, as the rest of them. In fact, the violent extremists are all offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, there are lots of conservatives who have been infected by the diagram on page 2. Among them are Dennis Prager even. All these people are on our sides, but they will not acknowledge that Islam itself is the problem. They think that, well, political Islam or militant Islam and so on, we'll be talking about those terms in a minute. Dennis Prager's only one. Hugh Hewitt, Bill O'Reilly, Megan Kelly, Michael Medved. Just last week, Michael Medved had on his show, I don't know whether anyone heard that, this woman, Karen Armstrong, who's a first-class liar and propagandist for Islam, who said on his show that there's nothing in the Quran which would justify what the extremists are doing, the violent extremists. And he didn't have the knowledge to contradict her. The fact that he had her on the program in the first place showed that he did not understand what Islam was all about. You're all familiar, of course, with what Ben Carson said about Islam a few weeks ago, that Islam is not compatible with our Constitution, not compatible with democracy. Michael Medved was one of the first people to attack Carson for saying that. So we have to get to these conservative journalists. I don't know what their email addresses are or their Facebook. Maybe you do. Maybe you have a way of getting to them and explaining to them the chart on page 3 is the accurate division here, and that Islam itself is the problem. Has anyone read Glenn Beck's new book? Remember the title? It is, in capital letters, it is about Islam. That was very brave of him to do that, because the title alone tells us the nature of the problem. It is about Islam. It is not about various types of Islam. Again, Islam is the Quran and Muhammad. And so that's what it is all about, because that's where the entire problem comes from. Let's now look at some more of the language and analyze the language that is used that people misunderstand, because it's this misunderstanding that is preventing us from getting our message across. The term political Islam. Dr. Jasser likes to use that a lot. Other people do too. Political Islam. Well, I went to a party put on by a moderate Muslim a few years ago. There were a lot of Muslims there, including Dr. Jasser, and I went around asking some of the Muslims, you know, what do you think about political Islam? And they looked at me like this, said, there is no such thing. There's no such thing as political Islam. Remember, Islam is the Quran and Muhammad. It is inherently political. It is not separate from Islam. Yosef Qaradawi, who, as you know, is the leading Islamic religious authority in the world today, he says that Islam is both worship and politics. Very important point. So you cannot separate political Islam from the rest of Islam, because the political aspects of Islam come from the same place that the rest of Islam comes from the Quran and from Muhammad. So this notion of political Islam, we have to get rid of that. And we have to tell people that that political Islam comes from the same place that the rest of Islam comes from, namely the Quran and Muhammad. Another one, Islamism. What in the world is Islamism? People will say, and I've heard this said even among conservatives, Islamism is the problem, not Islam. Again, they're trying to separate Islamism from Islam. What is Islamism? It is nothing more than putting into practice the doctrines of the Quran and Muhammad. That's all it is. Islam is the active, ideological movement to make the Quran and Muhammad the law of the land, that is Sharia law. That's what Islamism is. And so when you hear people use the word Islamism, remind them that that is only an aspect of Islam itself. It comes from Islam. Another one, people talk about versions of Islam. When we take Islam to mean the Quran and Muhammad, it doesn't come in different versions. You can pick up any copy of the Quran, any translation of it, and then compare several of them. You can go to various websites, Muslim websites, by the way, Muslim religious websites, which have searchable Qurans, and they'll give you 6 or 7 or 8 different English translations. You can go them and look up any verse from the Quran. There are no different versions. There are slightly different translations, but they all mean the same thing. There's one verse in the Quran which says that, and you've got that on page 4, in fact, number 1 at the top, if you want to take a glance at that, where it says, Allah says that non-Muslims are the worst of creatures, or the vilest of creatures. Other translations will have the lowest of animals. So it doesn't make any difference what translation it is. It all means the same thing, essentially subhuman. So there's no versions. And we have to get people to understand that there are no different versions of Islam, because it all goes back to the Quran and Muhammad. They talk about versions of Sharia law. Well, there are no versions in terms of what we're interested in. What interests us, by the way, about Sharia law and about Islam is only essentially their jihadism, their permanent war against non-Muslims. That's essentially what we're interested in. We don't care how they pray. We don't care about their holidays and so on, unless that affects us. And so, versions of Sharia law, no version of Sharia law, because it's all the same when it comes to, for example, death for apostasy, when it comes to making war on non-Muslims. There are no different versions. It's all the same. And so please tell people that Sharia law, like Islam, does not come in different versions. The BBC just the other day had this sentence: Saudi Arabia enforces a strict version of Islamic law. Well, it's not a version of Islamic law. They simply enforce Islamic law strictly. In other words, they enforce more of it than other countries which may enforce less of it. But it's not that the Sharia law changes. It's the application, the strict or less strict application. And this is not really splitting hairs, because if people think that Sharia law comes in mild versions, they will raise hopes that someday we will be able to spread this mild version around the Islamic world, and we'll all be fine again. But you can't do that because it doesn't come in different versions. All you can do is encourage Muslims not to apply Sharia law strictly. So get this notion of versions out of people's minds. It doesn't come in different versions. So what they mean by strict version is a strict application. Another term that we find all the time is extremism. Now, extremism is used as a euphemism. It doesn't really mean anything. Extremism. There are extremists, but not extremism. I mean, there are orthodontists, but there's no such thing as orthodontism, right? So we don't really have extremism as a philosophy of a way to behave. There are extremists whose behavior deviates from the norm. That's all extreme means. It means a deviation from the norm. Well, whether a person is extremist or not depends on what your norms are. This same imam that debated Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, I spoke to him several years ago, and I asked him, what do you think of Dr. Jasser? He says, Dr. Jasser is an extremist. Who? Dr. Jasser is an extremist. We think of Dr. Jasser as a moderate. But again, extremism means deviation from the norm. Dr. Jasser deviates from the Islamic norm, and therefore they consider him to be an extremist. So let's not get confused by the term extremist. Extremist means deviation from the norm. We look at these Muslims who go around cutting people's heads off as extremists because they deviate from our norms, not from Quranic and Muhammad norms. Does that make sense? It's extremism from our point of view, not from their point of view. That's a relative term. Look at the term radicalization. First of all, the term radical. Radical means, essentially goes back to the term meaning roots. So a radical is a person who goes to the roots of whatever belief system he's a radical of. In other words, he takes it literally, he follows it literally. That's what a radical does. And so we talk about radicalism. Okay, radicalism, again, people should be radicals, not radicalism, but radicals who follow the norms of Islam, the Quran, and Muhammad. They take it literally and seriously. Those are the radicals. What is radicalization? Well, you take a Muslim who was not born a radical, but at one point or another, he becomes a radical. Well, how does this happen? About 5 or 6 years ago, there was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal about how children of religious parents, of secular parents, secular Christians, secular Jews, and even secular Muslims, their children often become more religious than their parents. Only the Muslim parents were worried that their children would become radicalized. Why is that? Well, what happens when a teenager, for example, goes through all kinds of identity crises? He turns to his religion to establish his identity. And what does it mean in Islam? It means you read the Quran. You read the Quran and you read Muhammad, and you find out what your God really wants you to do. That's the process of radicalization. Radicalization is not going on the internet and being influenced by ISIS right away. They've already learned that their God requires them to make war on non-Muslims. And so that is what radicalization is all about. And see, people talk about radical Islam. Again, that's a false term. Because, as we have already said, Islam is the Quran and Muhammad. It doesn't come in radical or non-radical forms. It is what it is. You may be familiar with the slogan, radical Islam is the problem and moderate Islam is the solution. I won't mention who promotes this slogan, but he's one of us. It's misguided because there is no such thing as radical Islam or moderate Islam. And so moderate Islam cannot be a solution to radical Islam if neither one of them exists. Islam is Islam, and that's it. And so we cannot raise any false hopes that moderate Islam is going to save us, because it doesn't exist. There is no moderate Quran or immoderate Quran. And remember, Islam is the Quran. Take the word interpretation. I hear this all the time from people, that it all depends on how you interpret the Quran. Or that some people have a different interpretation of it. Well, there is no different interpretation of it. It is what it is. What they mean, what an interpretation is, in fact, is assigning a meaning to a text that is not immediately obvious. For example, you could interpret the story of Genesis allegorically. Many people have done that. That's an interpretation. It doesn't directly contradict the literal reading, but it's a different way of understanding the literal reading. When the Quran tells you, strike terror into the hearts of the unbelievers, cut their heads off, strike at their necks, and so on, there is no interpretation of that that changes the meaning of the word. The text says what it says. Now, there is a literal reading, but the literal reading is not an interpretation. An interpretation assigns a meaning that is different from the literal meaning. Does that make sense? And this is what we run into all the time. People talk, well, it all depends on how you interpret it. Could we hold the questions to the end? I'd appreciate it, because we have a lot of ground to cover. And so people talk about radical interpretation. No, it's not a radical interpretation. It's simply a literal reading and a strict following of the literal reading. That is not an interpretation. And so we have to be careful how we use that term interpretation. Interpretation, as I say, assigns a meaning that is not necessarily obvious, but it's different from the literal reading. The literal reading is not an interpretation. People who read it literally are not interpreting the Quran, they are following it. Another word that we run into frequently is cherry picking, and we get accused of cherry picking if we quote verses from the Quran. Well, folks, the Quran is considered to be Allah's literal words. And so cherry picking doesn't make any sense. Although when somebody says that, at least they're admitting that these verses are in the Quran. That's important to start with. But they're Allah's literal words, and there's nothing that can contradict them. And then, of course, you have the doctrine of abrogation, which I'm sure you're familiar with, whereby the later verses of the Quran supersede the earlier verses. So it's not a matter of cherry picking. You find the verse in the Quran, and if it is a later one, it supersedes the earlier one, and there's nothing wrong with taking out that verse and quoting it, because, hey, all of the Muslim terrorists do that. They know the Quran. They all quote it. Another one, context. They will tell you, well, you have to see those verses in context. A number of years ago, I had a debate with Dr. Jasser. We had a fairly good crowd, and I gave him some of these verses from the Quran, some of which you have on the back page there, and I asked him, Zudi, what do you do about these verses from the Quran? Well, it's very clear that the verses are aggressive against non-Muslims. And he said, well, we moderate Muslims have to do something about these toxic verses in the Quran. And I said, Zudi, toxic verses in the Quran? You're talking about Allah's literal word here. If you ever said that in a Muslim country, you'd be lucky to get out with your head still on. They're stuck, the moderate Muslims. There is no context that will change the meaning of those verses. And so it doesn't make any sense to look for context. Besides, the Quran is not organized chronologically, as you know anyway. By the way, who here has actually read the Quran? Oh, several people. I advise everybody to read the Quran, please. It's the most important book in the world. Not the best, but it's the most important one because more people take it seriously than they take any other book, including the Bible. The Quran is taken very, very seriously. Speaking of language, Does anyone stop to think about the name of the Council on American-Islamic Relations? CARE. You have relations between two different groups. You cannot have relations with yourself. And here they are setting up two opposing groups, American and Islam. Relations between the two. Normally people don't think of that, but they make that division. Now, for public consumption, they will tell you, oh, Muslims are as American as anybody else. But their name belies that. Their name tells us that, in fact, Muslims are not Americans in terms of values. We're not talking about passport citizenship, but in terms of values. That there is a contradiction between American and Islam. That's why they're having relations between the two of them. Now, let's look at a couple of words which they use but have different meanings from the way we use them. For example, freedom. Syed Qutb, who was the ideologue of the Muslim Brotherhood, has a statement, something to the effect that what Muslims are striving for universal freedom. What in the world could he be talking about? When Muslims use the term freedom, it is the freedom to practice Islam. Did you know that Muslims do not have religious freedom in the United States? If you look at it. And the reason is that Islam requires the practice of Sharia law, and Sharia law, for the most part, is forbidden in the United States because it violates American law, and Muslims are not permitted to practice those aspects of Sharia which violate American law. And so Muslims are not free to practice their religion here. Muslims are free not to practice Islam in the United States, and many of them do not practice Islam in the United States. You look at that chart on page 3. Again, you have this whole bottom section of the triangle of Muslims who do not follow the doctrines of Islam. Lots of them. Many of them don't go to mosque. Maybe 30 or 40% of American Muslims don't go to mosque. That's already a violation of Sharia law, and by the way, it carries the death penalty. Muslim males who refuse to go to Friday services are liable to be executed. It says so in Sharia law. Has anyone ever seen this book, Reliance of the Traveler? Right? Oh, some people have, obviously. Okay. That's a manual of Sharia law, the most popular one because it's all in one volume, 1,400 pages of it, and it is approved by the highest Islamic religious authorities in the world, from Saudi Arabia, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and the United States. And so this book is approved as the model for Muslims, Sunni Muslims, to practice Sharia law. And that book says very clearly lots of things. But one thing it says is that any male Muslim who refuses to go to the communal services on Friday will be executed. There's lots of things in there like that. Another word that is often used is tolerance. That people claim that Islam is tolerant. Well, what do they mean by that? Tolerance means that you are allowed to live. That's what tolerance means. For example, Christians and Jews are theoretically allowed to live under Islamic subjugation, subject to all kinds of restrictions on the practice of their religion, but they're allowed to live, as opposed to the pagans who don't have that choice. Pagans are not tolerated. They must either convert or die. But Christians and Jews are theoretically permitted to live. That's tolerance. So, very different understanding of it. Democracy. Well, we just had Ben Carson tell us that Islam is not compatible with democracy. Well, he's not the only one. Robert Spencer wrote a very good article listing a whole bunch of Muslim religious authorities who tell us that Islam is not compatible with democracy. Look at our Constitution. The preamble, we the people, starts out. That right away is a violation of Sharia law because Sharia law is not based on the people. It's based on their God, Allah, as expressed in the Quran. So democracy in Islam might mean that you're allowed to elect representatives, but the purpose of the representatives in Islam is not to make new laws deciding what is right and what is wrong, because that authority belongs to their God only. The purpose of representatives in Islam is to apply Sharia law to modern conditions. And that's it. So democracy, in the sense you can choose your representative, but the representative itself is limited. There's no such thing as the Bill of Rights and separation of powers and all this sort of stuff. They don't have that. Another word is justice. Listen to this statement, and guess who said it. Islam has always been a part of America's story. The truth is that America and Islam are not exclusive. Instead, they overlap and share common principles, principles of justice and progress, tolerance, and the dignity of all human beings. Guess who said that? Exactly. Remember when? In his maiden speech to the Muslim world in 2009 in Cairo. He said that. By the way, the very fact that he gave a speech to the Muslim world recognizes and legitimizes the division of the world into Muslims and non-Muslims, instead of into countries. We'll be talking about that in a moment. But here he says justice as a common principle that we share with Muslims. Well, how can it be? What does justice mean? Liberty and justice for all. Well, justice is a system essentially of rewards and punishments based on your moral and legal standards. That's what justice is. Well, justice in Islam is a system of rewards and punishments based on Sharia law, which is based on the Quran. And that's very different from our laws and values. And so we do not share the common meaning of justice. Justice is very different there and here. Another word is innocent. You'll hear this all the time. Islam is against killing innocents. And people just lap that up. But the question is, who is considered innocent? Well, in Islam, anybody who resists Islam is not innocent. Verse 533 of the Quran makes it very clear. Anybody who resists Allah and Muhammad and the spread of Islam is to be crucified or have their limbs cut off from opposite sides. They are enemies. And so all non-Muslims who refuse to convert are not innocent. And so we have to understand that when we talk to people and explain to them, and they come and say, well, Islam says that they never persecute innocent people. Well, of course they do, but not innocent in our terms. It's the people who are not innocent in their terms. And by the way, no Israeli can be considered innocent in Islam. And so it's all right to kill any Israeli because they're not innocent. Okay, now let's look at the logic of Islam. We need to understand this in order to find out and to be able to communicate it, just what the nature of Islam is. The fundamental premise of Islam, we've alluded to this before, is that the Quran is considered to be Allah's literal word. Perfect, complete, unchangeable, and valid for all of eternity. This has very profound consequences, namely that if it comes directly from their God, God's literal word, everybody is stuck with it forever, Muslims and non-Muslims. Nobody can ever reform God's literal word. After all, what human being dare monkey with God's literal word? You can't do that. And so Muslims can't either, and that's why the moderate Muslims never talk about the Quran and Muhammad, even though they understand that that's what has to be reformed if you're going to reform Islam. But the very notion of reforming something that is perfect is logically absurd. You can't reform anything that's perfect. And so Islam cannot be reformed because the fundamental premise is that it is already perfect. Islam is the Quran and Muhammad. Those are perfect. That's the first thing that you need to know about Islam. The second thing you need to know about Islam is what the content of the Quran is. Now that you know that the Quran is Allah's literal word, you have to know what the content of the Quran is. Well, most of you have an idea about it, but if you want to turn to page 4 again, you see just a couple of phrases. The first one was about non-Muslims being the lowest, the vilest of human beings. Or, sorry, not human beings, the vilest of creatures. Not human beings, that's important. I have a text by one of the Muslim ulama, which is the recognized scholars, about 40 years ago, where he says very plainly that non-Muslims are beyond the pale of humanity. So the notion that Muslims are fully human and non-Muslims who reject Islam are not fully human, this is something that comes directly from the Quran. Doesn't mean all Muslims believe it, but they're supposed to believe it. In fact, on a website, once a Muslim website, under a pseudonym, I was asked a question of this Muslim woman and gave her that passage from the Quran, number 1 that you have there. And I asked, do you really believe this, that non-Muslims are the worst of creatures, not human? She said yes. She has to say yes, because that's Allah's literal word. She has no choice about that. So if you pin people down on this, they have to say that. Now the next one is that non-Muslims are your inveterate enemies, whether we like it or not. We have President Bush, President Obama telling us we are not at war with Islam, we will never be at war with Islam, we are not your enemy. Well, he can say that all he wants, but they know that we are the enemy because their God tells them so. So all of our policies in Iraq and Afghanistan based on winning the hearts and minds of a Muslim population are undermined fundamentally because their God tells them that we are the enemy. No matter how many mosques we build for them, how many water filtration plants and schools and whatever, it doesn't make any difference. They will take it, but they will never consider us to be their friends. The Quran does not permit them to do that. Now, how does Islam view the world? Well, you know that the Quran, and I urge you to read it if you have not already done so, divides the world into 2 parts, Muslims and non-Muslims. That's the division. They don't see countries like we do. We look out of our window and we see there's Mongolia and China and Brazil and Uruguay and all the rest of them. They don't see that. They see Muslims and non-Muslims. And it doesn't make any difference what country you are in. You are either in our camp, the Muslim camp, part of the Muslim Ummah, or you are not. Or you're in the house of war. In other words, because Muslims are commanded to make war against non-Muslims, you're either with us or against us. The entire Muslim community is considered to be a nation. It's a nation in every sense of the word. And that's where your loyalty is. That's where your identity is. We have many examples like that. Look at the Boston bombers, Chechens from Chechnya. What in the world are they doing killing people in Boston? Well, it has nothing to do with the fact that they're Chechens. You would think if they were Chechen nationalists, they would be out killing Russians. But they didn't do that. They killed Americans. Why? Because first and foremost, their identity is Islamic. They're Muslims, first and foremost. And so they are at war with non-Muslims wherever they happen to be. And they happen to be in Boston. So they killed non-Muslims in Boston. Again, they're part of the nation. You heard of Farrakhan's group, of course, the Nation of Islam. The concept of nation is very strong in Islam, and they tell us that. The Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran tells us that Muslims, all Muslims, form a single nation. So keep that in mind. Next, of course, Muslims are considered superior to non-Muslims. We already talked about that non-Muslims are considered less than human. And you've got the statement from in the Quran also. I don't know whether it's actually in this one or not. It says that followers of Muhammad are merciful to believers and harsh or ruthless to unbelievers. It's the opposite of the golden rule, which has no qualifications. But in Islam, if you're a believer, you're treated one way. If you're an unbeliever, you're treated another way. And then this other division of the world, of course, is into men and women, whereby men are considered morally and legally superior to women. This is a point that we really need to get across to people because our notion of gender equality is very strong, even and especially among liberals. We have to get it across to them that Islam undermines that and says from the beginning that women are inferior. And that might be one way to get to them. Try it. Another aspect here is human rights. since non-Muslims are considered legally and morally inferior, and women are legally morally inferior, that contradicts our notion of human rights. You can talk to people about human rights and show them that the Muslim world has their own version of human rights called the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam. You can Google it. And it says very specifically in there that all human rights must come from Sharia law, which includes the inferiority of non-Muslims and women. So the first misunderstanding then of Islam, we talked about before, that Islam is only the Quran and Muhammad. The second major misunderstanding that blocks people from appreciating it is that they think of Islam as another religion. And in America, you can't criticize someone else's religion. We have religious freedom, and so it's wrong, they think, to criticize someone else's religion. What they don't know is that Islam is not just a religion. And this is in the words of the Islamic religious authorities. All of what I'm giving you here is not my opinion. It comes straight from the Islamic religious authorities, where they will tell us that Islam is a complete way of life, or they use the word a complete code of life. That's the law code, that's Sharia law. Or if you look at the bottom of page 4, you've got another quotation where it says that Islam is a comprehensive ideology. By the way, they call it an ideology. I didn't make that up. And so it's a comprehensive ideology. Now look at those words, complete, comprehensive. Another word for that could be total, which means their ideology is totalitarian. So Islam is not just a religion, it is a totalitarian ideology. And they will tell us that. They don't use the word totalitarian because that's not nice, but they do call it complete, and they do call it comprehensive. And it covers everything, covers all aspects of life, and they tell us that it does. And so they tell us that Islam is not a religion like other religions, and we have to believe them. And we have to tell other people that Islam is not a religion like other religions, and therefore should not be treated like other religions. If it is fundamentally different from other religions, it does not deserve the privileges of other religions. But people need to understand that. As long as they think that Islam is just a religion, there's no way to get through to them. It's useless, and we're going to lose. Because Muslims will that is, the Muslim community will masquerade as a religion and want all of the privileges of religion, but in fact, they are promoting an ideology. Now, in addition to being totalitarian, if you look at the other verses from the Quran and Muhammad on page 4, where they declare war against non-Muslims, and they declare war until everybody is Muslim, until Islam triumphs throughout the world. That is imperialism, taken to the nth degree, because they want the whole world. That's the purpose of Islam, is to establish a worldwide caliphate. So Islam is an ideology, both totalitarian and imperialist. If you speak of it to other people that way and show them with these verses from the Quran and Muhammad, so you can prove that it is, using their words, we might be able to get through to them. Because then we'll take their mind off religion and focus on ideology. There was a time when America focused on ideology, fascism, communism. People can understand that. And we have to get them to understand that Islam is an ideology, not just a religion. Don't say that it's not a religion. That will shut people off right away. You can't get through to them. You have to tell them what the Muslims tell us. It is a religion, but not a religion like other religions. That's what they need to understand. Those words are important. If Islam is a totalitarian ideology and an imperialist ideology, what is a mosque? Well, a mosque is not just a house of prayer, because Islam is not just a religion like other religions. So a mosque becomes a propagation center for the ideology. And in fact, we have the words of Yosef Qaradawi, who tells us precisely that. And by the way, if anybody wants these Islamic sources that back up everything I'm saying here, you have my email address at the bottom of each page. Send me an email. I'll be happy to send you the quotations from the Islamic sources. He says that the mosque, since the time of the Prophet, was a propagation center for their ideology. So it's coming from the Islamic religious authorities. The next logical conclusion of the fact that Islam was a totalitarian and imperialist ideology concerns loyalty. It's not considered nice to impugn the loyalty of anybody. You may remember a few years ago there were 5 congressmen who sent a letter to investigate the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in our government. It was led by Michelle Bachmann. There was Trent Franks and Louis Goldberg and a couple of others. They also mentioned in investigating the Muslim Brotherhood, Huma Abedin, whom I'm sure you all know, is Hillary Clinton's deputy, who has been advising Hillary Clinton about the Muslim world all the time, because Hillary doesn't know anything about it. And so she relies on Huma Abedin. Who is Huma Abedin? Well, her entire family is Muslim Brotherhood. Her father was an imam with the Muslim Brotherhood until he died. Her mother is a member of the Sisterhood of the Muslim Brotherhood and still teaches at a women's college in Saudi Arabia. Huma Abedin herself went to Georgetown and was on the executive committee of the Muslim Student Association, which is Muslim Brotherhood. She wrote for the journal that her family sponsored, which was a Muslim Brotherhood journal. So she herself has all of these Muslim Brotherhood ties. When the congressman hinted that she needs to be investigated because of her ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, she was bitterly and disgracefully, mercilessly attacked, not only by the Democrats, but by the Republican elite. John McCain came down their throat for this. Well, what's going on here? A religious Muslim cannot be loyal to the United States or anything other that is not Muslim because it's a totalitarian ideology. There is no room for loyalty to anything else. If you're loyalty to a totalitarian system, loyal to a totalitarian system, you cannot be loyal to anything else. You must be loyal only to that. And we have the words of the Islamic religious authorities about that. There's a phrase, I think, on bottom of page 4. You've got there where a leader of the Council on American Islamic Relations says that if we are practicing Muslims, what is the last word? We cannot, we are above the law of the land. Yes. If we're practicing Muslims, we are above the law of the land. They say that. In addition to that, by the way, Dr. Jasser wrote a very good article about 5 years ago, appeared in the Wall Street Journal, calling into question the loyalty of American Muslim soldiers serving in our army. And he quoted the highest religious authority, Muslim religious authority in the United States, which said very plainly that there is an irreconcilable contradiction between loyalty to Islam and loyalty to the United States. Again, that's perfectly logical. If Islam is a totalitarian system, you cannot have loyalty to anything else. Jihad, well, you all know about jihad. The book on Sharia law, which I quoted before, Reliance of the Traveler, says very clearly, quote, jihad means to war against non-Muslims. You can't get plainer than that. That's what jihad is. Now, war is conducted in many ways. There's not only hot war, we're all familiar with that, and the danger of focusing on that is that it takes away our attention from the stealth jihad, as Robert Spencer wrote a book about, or silent jihad, or the cultural jihad, a civilizational jihad. We don't see it if we look only at the top. And so that's another reason why that diagram on page 3 is so important, because we're talking not only about that top part, we're talking about this enormous, huge middle part, which shares the same goals as the top part, but they're just not violent. And we don't see them if we look only at the top. We need to point out to people that it's not just the top that is a problem, it's the subversive aspects of the Muslims on the bottom. Sorry, not on the bottom, the ones in the middle who share the same supremacist goals. Let me speak for just a quick moment about the Middle East conflict. On page 4, you've got a couple of quotations, one from the Quran, that's verse 929, in which Allah says, make war or fight those, the people of the book, that means Christians and Jews, until they pay the special tax and submit to Islamic law. So it's a declaration of war against Jews and Christians until they submit to Islamic law. And then you have the verse from Muhammad which talks about fighting the Jews. Some of them will hide behind stones, and the stones will cry out saying, Abdullah, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him. So this is a call to genocide, and this quotation by Muhammad is considered sacred to all religious Muslims. Both of these taken together mean that the Muslims, if they are religious, can never make peace with Jews. That, folks, is the reason for the conflict over Israel. It has nothing to do with territory. It's not a matter of drawing new lines on old maps. It's not a matter of settlements. And if you read the Hamas charter, and I advise you to do that, you can Google it, read the text, they make it very clear that this is a war against the Jews. It's not over territory. By the way, do you know who the deadliest enemy of Israel is? Iran. And what's the real name of Iran? Not Persia. The Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, the Iranians are not Palestinians. They are not Arabs. In fact, they don't like Arabs. Why are Iranians... Pardon? Well, they were, yes. Why are they Israel's deadliest enemy? Well, because they're Islamic, not because they're Iranian. Before Khomeini took over Iran in 1979, Iran was an ally of Israel. So it's not the Iranians per se as an ethnic group that's a problem. It's the fact that the country is dedicated to Islam. So the war against Israel is by all Muslim countries, and it is because of the doctrines of Islam, and you have two of those doctrines right in front of you. You can explain that to people. So what we're talking about here is not conceding various pieces of territory to the Palestinians. It's not a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The Palestinians don't even have a right under Islam to concede any territory. And they will tell you that. So it's not a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's not even an Arab-Israeli conflict, as it used to be called. It is an Islamic holy war against the Jews, just like the Hamas charter says it is. And by the way, Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's not just Hamas. And when they quote this passage from Muhammad, they're not making it up. That is sacred to all religious Muslims. So that, in a nutshell, is what the conflict over Israel is all about. Now, what do we do about all of this? What is to be done? It's up to you and me and everybody else who now understands these things. And you are now able to clear up the semantic mess that is preventing people from understanding, people who should be on our side, including all of those conservative people in the media. They should be on our side, but because they don't understand the correct definitions of Islam, and they don't understand that Islam is not just a religion, they are in fact not on our side when it comes to Islam, because they are preventing us from taking action against Islam. And there's lots of actions that we can take, or at least have to be done on a legislative level. We won't talk about those here, but what can you do? Well, you know, the question of Islam has now been opened up in the Republican presidential campaign because of Dr. Ben Carson, who says that Islam, and he had no compunction about naming Islam. He didn't say radical Islam. He said Islam is not compatible with democracy and not compatible with our Constitution. We need to encourage that discussion. Everybody you meet, you all have your spheres of influence. Some of them are larger than others. Use those spheres of influence to get this point across that it is about Islam, as the title of Glenn Beck's book has it. Whenever you have contact to candidates, or if you don't have contact, then make the contact, call them, send emails to them, let them know that they need, for example, to declare the Muslim Brotherhood to be a terrorist organization. There is a bill in Congress, which has, I guess, been tabled for the time being, called the Muslim Brotherhood Terrorist Designation Act of 2014. Urge your representatives to get that out of committee and vote on it. We must go after the Muslim Brotherhood. We don't have to call it Islam as such, but people will get the message. Start with the Muslim Brotherhood. There are other things that you can do. You're active people, you're intelligent people, educated people, you write, you know how to write letters. We can organize focused email campaigns, action alerts. If you're interested in doing that, maybe once a week, write a short email. We need you. Because if somebody opens up his email in the morning and has 1,000 emails in his inbox about Islam, he'll pay attention. The Council on American Islamic Relations organizes action alerts to support Islam around the country. They even tell us what the issues are, and they tell us who to write to. We need to take that information and write to those people and tell them just the opposite. They also give us websites of articles that support their position. We can go to those websites and contribute our comments in the readers' comments. And you'd be surprised what kind of interesting discussions you can have. You can reach new people that way because lots of readers read it. The Wall Street Journal has readers' comments. Anybody ever write comments for the Wall Street Journal? You can do that. And I urge you to do that. You can quote something from the Quran, quote something from Muhammad. Mention that Islam is not just a religion, but also an ideology. People need to read that, and hundreds of people will read that. So that's something you can do. We need to spread the word. Another thing, is anybody here active in the a political party? I won't mention any names. A couple people. Oh, good. As precinct committeeman or precinct captain or whatever you call it, head of the precinct, that's the way to be really active, not just to attend meetings. That's not good enough. Get active in the party apparatus. Become a precinct head. I don't know what they call them here in California. It's precinct committee person in Arizona. But these people have more influence on the voters and on the candidates than other members of the Republican Party have. And I understand that around the country there are over 200,000 vacant precinct captain positions. If they were taken over by people like you, we could turn the Republican Party around. And we have to do it, because if the Republican Party does not save us with regard to Islam, nobody will. The Democrats are already in the pockets of the Muslims, literally. The Republicans are split. We need to turn over that split and push the Republicans to take a stand on Islam. Ben Carson has done it. Ted Cruz is sort of doing it. He still talks about radical Islam, but he's pretty strong on it. We need to push that. We need to get all of the candidates to bring this discussion out in the open. So I hope that you now have a little understanding more than you did before about how to present it to people who are not yet on our side, especially the conservatives, because the conservative movement is divided, and we must bring them on our side. And if we present a more or less united face and have our conservative journalists speak about Islam as the problem, we can begin influencing lots and lots of people. Okay, thank you very much. I'll stay for questions. Thank you.
Before we take the first question, I know we started late and we usually wrap these things up around 9 o'clock, so if you have other plans and you have to go, feel free to go, but the good doctor's not going anywhere.
No, I'm staying here tonight.
Stay and ask a question, feel free, but I did want to let you know if you have other plans, then don't feel bad, you can leave. So thank you, doctor, that was fantastic.
Thank you.
He will now take
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you for coming and listening. The Sunnis and the Shias. We don't have time to go into the origin of the split, but it's 1,300 years old. It started when one party wanted a direct descendant of Muhammad to become the caliph, and the other party said, no, it doesn't have to be a direct descendant. We can take anybody who is a true Muslim. It started that way, and then they became split. We don't have time to go into it now. For our purposes, the Sunnis and the Shiites are equally our enemies. Equally, they consider us to be their enemies. They have the same Quran, and they have the same Muhammad. And they have the phrases that you have on page 4, which they all use that. The notion of jihad in Shia Islam is exactly the same as in Sunni Islam. So from our point of view, it doesn't make any difference whether they are Shiite or Sunni. Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, is Shiite. They want nuclear weapons. And by the way, check out the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran. You can Google it, and you will find in the preamble where it says that the armed forces of the Islamic Republic are to be used not only for defending the frontiers of the country, but for spreading the word of Islam and fulfilling their ideological mission of jihad, quote unquote. This is their jihad, spreading the word of Islam to the rest of the world, and they're going to use their armed forces to do it. It's a declaration of aggression, military aggression, against the rest of the world. It is in their constitution. And nobody's aware of that, but it's there for anyone to see. Yes, sir, could you stand up and speak loudly, please? I'm a little hard of hearing. So that everybody can hear.
I don't want to waste my time reading care propaganda. So is there an English version of the Quran that I can read? And especially, is there an English version that's chronological instead of mixed up by the way the Arabic Quran is organized with larger verses?
Yes, let me answer that. Yes, there is a version that puts the verses in chronological order. It's done by Dr. Bill Warner, whom some of you may be familiar with. However, to answer your first question, yes, there are many Muslim websites. Go on to anyone. Google search searchable Quran. That's all you need to search, and you will get a number of Muslim websites which offer you many translations. They're not versions, they're translations of the Quran, and you can compare the translations. These are from Muslim religious websites. The Quran that CARE is passing out, in fact, I got one several years ago. Interesting. It's a big book. It weighs about 10 pounds. You could do your exercises with it. Glossy pages. It has not only the translation, it has a transliteration, and it has the Arabic, and it has commentary on it. Big fat book. It is put together by Muhammad Asad, who is the grandson of an Orthodox rabbi. He went to Palestine in the 1920s and decided he didn't like the Jews anymore, so he went to Saudi Arabia and became a Muslim. And he made it his life's work to write this tremendous compendium. He, by the way, I believe was the first ambassador to the United Nations from Pakistan. So he's thoroughly Muslim. Now, this is the translation that CARE is passing out. It's an expensive book, about $60 or $70 if you were to buy it, but you can get it free. Muslims don't use it because Assad tries to soften the harsh passages in the Quran. You look at his commentary and he'll kind of try to explain them away, and that's why Muslims don't use it. But in order to get a reliable version, not a version, reliable translation, there's not a version. We talked about the use of the word version. There are no versions of the Quran, but the reliable translation, there are many of them. Get one that is recommended by the Muslim websites, or go to a mosque, a large mosque, and ask for one. I've done that. I have several different translations of the Quran, and they'll give it to you. They're only too happy to give you a Quran because they assume that you're not going to read it. But they will assume that, oh, you've got a Quran, and you will think that, oh, the Muslims are so tolerant. And so you will show this to other people. That's like the Quran that CARE is passing out. It's a coffee table edition. And so people will put it on their coffee table and show their guests and their family and their relatives and friends, oh, we have this big Quran, isn't this nice? But they've never read it. So yes, you can certainly get a reliable version, reliable translation of the Quran. There are lots of them around. Get one from a mosque or from the Muslim religious website. And the reason is that when you talk to other people, you can tell them more authoritatively that this is the Quran that is approved by the Islamic religious authorities. And so nobody can say, well, that's a bad translation. They can't get you on that. And by the way, speaking of translation, people will sometimes tell you that you can't rely on the English translation, you have to speak Arabic. Nonsense. All of the Muslim terrorists, almost all of them, are Arabs. They don't read the Quran in translation. They read the Arabic, and they come up to the same conclusions. Yes, sir.
I wanted to thank you for speaking tonight. I wish there were more younger people here tonight to hear the message.
I wish so too, but...
What suggestions do you have for talking to people about the idea of bringing more Muslims into this country, the refugee story? How do you talk about that beyond,
Good point.
Judeo-Christian civilization?
I wouldn't talk so much about Judeo-Christian civilization. Mention to them that Muslim immigrants are not just immigrants, just like Islam is not just a religion, that these Muslim immigrants are bringing with them all of the baggage of Islam, and you can explain to them what that entails and the consequences of that. That these people bringing with them the notion that non-Muslims are inferior and less than human. They're bringing with them the notion, if they are religious, and probably most of them are, not all of them, but most of them are, if they're religious, that they must make war, jihad, against non-Muslims, and eventually Islam must take over the world. They believe that.
Talk about, is it good to suggest that people that in general are not interested in assimilating to become Americans, but are interested in bringing Islam to another land? What is it,
Hijra, yes, many Muslims now feel that emigrating to non-Muslim countries is the way to spread Islam. And they're right. It's working. There are more than 55 million Muslims in Europe, I understand, and they don't assimilate like other immigrants did. Other immigrants could assimilate because their values did not contradict the host country's values. In Islam, they're bringing with them the values of Islam. And so for a Muslim, a religious Muslim, to assimilate, he would have to give up his Islamic values. And that's what prevents Muslim immigrants from assimilating. Now, there are some Muslims who are less religious, like the ones on the bottom of the triangle. They can assimilate because they're not religious. So in other words, they don't share Islamic values, even though they still identify themselves as Muslims. Does that make sense? So talk to people. The immigration problem is perhaps one of the most serious problems because it cannot be reversed. Once you change the demography of the country, you can't reverse that. And not only that, Muslims tend to reproduce at a much faster rate than non-Muslims do. And by the way, Muslim men, even in immigration, often have more than one wife. You put one officially as a wife, the others go on welfare. But he has an Islamic marriage to as many as 4 of them, and it exists all over Europe. It exists in the United States and Canada as well. So demography, that's part of the demographic jihad. Jihad takes many forms. One is the demographic, and that is through immigration and reproduction. So yes, immigration is very serious. Is anyone here familiar with resettlement? Oh, the name of the website, Ann Corcoran's book. She's very good. She's drawing attention to the immigration problem. She needs our support, and spread that message too, that the immigrants do not assimilate because Islam is not a religion like other religions and therefore does not share our values. Yes, sir. Back there. Speak loudly, please. Yes. On the bottom. Well, you know, the first victims of Islam are the Muslims. We don't tend to think of it that way, but you see that in ISIS, what ISIS is doing now in Iraq. They're slaughtering Muslims because those Muslims don't support them, so they're somewhat less strict in their application of Sharia law. They're not as religious as ISIS think they should be. The Taliban, the same way. They were killing lots of Muslims in Afghanistan. They still are. So Muslims are the first victims, and those Muslims at the bottom, those will be the first victims when the ones at the top take political power. When they have the power to enforce Sharia law, they will enforce it first on the secular Muslims and then on the non-Muslims. Yes?
Do you think that that's possibly one of the reasons that our so-called moderate Muslims do not speak out against?
Yeah, why do moderate Muslims not speak out? Well, the reason is that they still identify themselves as Muslims. To speak out would require speaking about the Quran and Muhammad. And as soon as they do that, if they call anything in the Quran and Muhammad into question, they would lose their identity as Muslims. Now, they've been raised with the identity as Muslims. It's been in their family for generations and generations. It's not an easy thing to do, to apostatize, to declare that you're not a Muslim anymore. Even in this country, they don't have to be afraid of being killed. In a Muslim country, they would be killed because there is the death penalty for apostasy. But that's not the case here because it just doesn't happen much or really at all in America. There are some honor killings, but it's not quite the same. There are organizations of ex-Muslims. They are in public. They exist. And so why do Muslims not apostatize? Because they would lose their friends, they would lose their relatives, they would lose their customers if they have businesses with Muslims. And so there's a lot of pressure on them not to give up their Muslim identity. Let me tell you a little story about Dr. Jasser. About 4 years ago, a friend of mine had a letter published in the Phoenix Jewish News in which she quoted that passage by Muhammad about the Jews hiding behind stones, go and kill him. And the Jewish News didn't want to publish it by itself, so they went to Dr. Jasser to ask him what he thought of this. Well, Dr. Jasser, as the moderate Muslim, cannot disagree with Muhammad because he would lose his identity as a Muslim if he disagreed with this passage by Muhammad. But he couldn't agree with it either because then he would lose his cachet as moderate. So he said it was forged. It was forged, that Muhammad never said it. Well, how in the world does he know? The fact is, for more than 1,000 years, all of the Islamic religious scholars said that Muhammad did say it. But that's the dilemma that moderate Muslims are in. They can't criticize the Quran and Muhammad, otherwise they would lose their Muslim identity. And so they don't. They speak out against ISIS, they speak out against political Islam, but they'll never tell you where political Islam comes from, because that would mean getting to the Quran and Muhammad, and they can't go there. That make sense? Yes, ma'am.
Incitement. I know that Prime Minister Netanyahu has really made a big deal recently, and rightly so, about incitement in the Palestinian schools on television. If there was not incitement, if they stopped doing it, would it still be the same result?
Well, you've already seen that a religious Muslim cannot make peace with Jews because their God forbids it and their prophet forbids it. Their God says you must make war against the Jews until they submit to Islamic law, and their prophet, Muhammad, says you must fight them and kill them. And so there's no way that religious Muslims can make peace with the Jews. There's a second element, by the way, in the Israeli situation. And it's part of Islamic law that once any territory has been conquered by Muslims, it is considered sacred Muslim territory forever, even if it is reconquered by somebody else, like the Spaniards retook Spain. Well, the Muslims want it back because it's considered Muslim territory. Well, the territory of today's Israel, of course, used to be under the Ottoman Empire, so it used to be Muslim territory. It is considered by Muslims to be Muslim territory forever. And so you have these two elements that prevent peace in with Israel. The first one is that they're required to make war against the Jews and either submit them or subjugate them to Islamic law or to kill them. And the second one is that it's on territory that was once controlled by Muslims. So without incitement, the incitement is perfectly natural. It has to be there. But even if you were to take it away, there still would be no peace. You would still have Hamas. You would still have Fatah, which in their charters they have both declared that Israel must be destroyed. There's no question about that. And that was before the incitement. But the incitement is perfectly natural. By the way, the incitement is based on this cult of martyrdom, which is strictly a religious concept. Has nothing to do with territory. So it's a religious concept. By the way, for those of you who read the Quran, you will remember that verse 9:111 says that Muslims who fight in the way of Allah and who kill and are killed will go straight to paradise. So you slay and are slain. That's the martyrdom verse in the Quran. There's another verse or two also about martyrdom, but it's very much apart. It's, by the way, the so-called suicide bombers, they're not considered suicides by the Muslims. Suicide is taking your own life for personal reasons. That's prohibited. But fighting for Allah and losing your life, that gets you straight to paradise. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Loudly, please.
When I read the extreme comments, I've read the Old Testament many times, and they say they're annihilating whole villages because you don't believe in, the God of Yahweh or whatever. So when I read these extreme passages, they don't freak me out as much as the Sharia law aspect does. And I question America's policy to have recently gone in and tried to get rid of Mubarak. When we were in spend time in Egypt, Egypt was actually fairly peaceful under Mubarak. It is now back with the secular regime. We're doing the same thing with Assad. We're not supporting Assad, who actually is a secular regime. He's brutal. He's horrible. But they're not going to have it any better under a religious person. Then you go to Iraq. We've done the same thing. We turn on Saddam Hussein. So our policies are so screwy in this
Yes.
country that who is ever going to want to support us?
Well, the reason that our policy is so screwed up,
And the Bushes, the Republicans, the Democrats, they're all screwed.
we call it screwed up. It's all based on a misunderstanding of Islam. We started out by defining Islam as the Quran and Muhammad and not as Muslims' behavior. And so we're all under the impression, not all, the ones who are conducting American policy are under the impression that if you just get rid of the dictators, then the Muslim population, there's nothing wrong with it because there's nothing wrong with Islam, they think. And that has cost us many thousands of American lives and trillions of dollars trying to get these societies to become democratic and peaceful. Well, they can't do it because they're Muslim. Well, what we did, of course, we overthrew Saddam Hussein, and we now have ISIS. We had Al-Qaeda in Iraq before, and even in addition to that, we have now made the Shiites in Iraq, who are the majority. Our democracy put the majority in power, but that made Iraq into a semi-satellite of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is also Shiite. We overthrew, as you said, Mubarak. We helped to overthrow it. We put the Muslim Brotherhood in power in Egypt until that was overthrown by General Sisi. In Libya, we overthrew Gaddafi under the assumption, well, if we get rid of this nasty dictator, we can get a democracy in Libya. Well, Libya is in a state of total anarchy now, dominated by various Muslim Brotherhood type groups, or worse. And so this is the notion that John McCain has been under, that Obama has been under, that Bush has been under. We made our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan on that basis, that if you get rid of the dictators, we could make the society democratic. And what they didn't understand is the nature of Islam that dominates the hearts and minds of the population. So it's very important that we distinguish then these notions of Islamism and Islam, rather not distinguish them, but we have to relate them to one another. They are not distinct from one another. The notion that they are distinct, as I said, cost us already thousands of lives and trillions of dollars. If you get rid of the Islamists, Islam is fine, but it's not fine. And that's the message that we need to get across to people, because there's maybe more of it. You know, you think you're going to get rid of Assad, who's a nasty dictator. What are we going to get in return? Well, it's not going to be democracy, not liberal with a small L, or Democrats with a small D. You just can't do that. What you get is what you see now. You get ISIS, al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and various other Muslim Brotherhood groups. Yes, sir.
You asked the question, what can be done?
Yes.
It seems to me that we're in this
Yes. We have to do that, but it cannot be done until enough people understand that it needs to be done and why it needs to be done. That's why we need your help to help get more people to understand this. If we stick with the numbers that we have, it's just not enough. Apparently there's been some progress. There's very little good news coming out, but the Council on American Islamic Relations has given us a little bit of good news from our point of view, not from their point of view. Apparently the percentage of Americans who have a negative view of Islam has slightly increased over the last few years. Not so much because of our efforts, but because of ISIS. Something is seeping through. But we need to, it's up to about 55% have a negative view of Islam. And my question is, what planet are the other 45% living on? Well, we need to get to that other 45% and raise the percentage of people who have a negative view of Islam, which is essentially an accurate view of Islam. And they will see that it's negative according to our values. We just need to get them to understand what Islam really is. Yes, sir. I'm glad you brought that up. People all, and that includes Dr. Jasser too. He says, well, Islam has to undergo a reformation like Christianity underwent a reformation. What they don't understand is the nature of that reformation. The Christian Reformation did not reform the Gospels. It reformed the Catholic Church. It was a revolt against the political power of the Catholic Church, and it put the religious texts into the hands of the believers. You have had a revolution, a reform like that in Islam. For hundreds and hundreds of years, Muslims were going along without much consciousness of the jihadist nature of Islam. They were just going about their business. Well, with the Wahhabis and the others, they have now put the Quran back into the center of a Muslim's life. That is the Reformation that is equivalent to the Christian Reformation. It's going back to the texts, not making their behavior better. It's going back to the texts. That was the nature of the Christian Reformation, and that is what is going on in Islam. People are returning to the Quran. And that's where the problem is, because the Quran is fundamentally different from the Judeo-Christian text. Yeah, there's lots of nastiness in the Old Testament, but there's nothing in the Old Testament which says that the Jews have to make war against non-Jews so that Judaism can take over the world. It's not there. There is no imperialism in the Old Testament. It's a description of historical events. There were wars over territory, and that was it. And then after that, there were no more wars for territory. In Islam, as you see from those couple of quotations you have on page 4, make war against non-Muslims until Islam takes over the world. That is imperialism. You don't have that in the Old Testament, let alone the New Testament. Christians have a universal religion. They want everybody to become Christian in order to become saved. And the way they go about that is you go forth and preach the gospel to every living creature. It doesn't say make war on them. Islam does say make war on them. That's the fundamental difference in the texts. And in terms of Reformation, the analogy is absolutely false if you think that a Reformation has to make people better. The Christian Reformation was a return to the Christian sacred texts, putting it in the hands of people instead of through the intermediaries of the Catholic Church. In Islam, there are no intermediaries like a Catholic Church. Everyone has the same relationship to God, Allah. And the only way to find out what Allah wants is to read the Quran. And that is what the Islamic revolution and reform has been all about, what they call the Islamic resurgence. It's a return to the literal texts. Well, now those of you who have read the Quran know that when you pick up the Quran, there is no order to it except the longest chapter to the shortest chapter. No chronology, no thematic order. The first page of the Quran was an opening prayer, but after that is the longest chapter to the shortest chapter. And so how do you know which verse supersedes the earlier verses, which verses the later verses? Well, you can Google that. You can Google a table which will list the verses in chronological order to the extent that it's known. And so you can find out which verses came later, and you will see that the more aggressive verses came later and therefore supersede the less aggressive verses. If you're familiar with Muhammad's prophetic career, so to say, he spent his first 13 years in Mecca, where he was a tiny minority. And he could not afford to be aggressive. He would have been crushed. As it was, he was persecuted. Finally, he moved his band of merry followers to Medina. There was only about 150 people that he had in 13 years. He was not successful. When he got to Medina, he gradually acquired political power, still getting these revelations from Allah. And the more political power he acquired, the more aggressive these verses became. Until finally he acquired absolute dictatorial power, and that's when you have the offensive jihad, where Muslims must go and make war on everybody else. And by the way, there's a verse in the Quran which is kind of interesting, where it says that fighting is ordained for you even though you don't like it. What this shows us is that even in Muhammad's time, many Muslims didn't want to go out on jihad. But he got this revelation from Allah saying you have to do it anyway, even though you don't like it. So there was a division in the Muslim community even in Muhammad's time. And just as there is today, there are these Muslims on the bottom of the triangle who don't want to have anything to do with jihad, but they're supposed to. Does that make sense? Okay.
We'll try to get 2 more questions.
Oh, all right. Yes.
So Jasser's going on TV and convincing people that we're nuts and we're giving Islam a bad name. Who's going to go on? Are you going to be our eagle that we fly? I told my friend, I said, I'm going to go ask a sparrow how eagle flies. I'm going to go hear you speak. And what are we going to do?
What are we going to do? You can talk to the... Well, that's fine. If you can do that, I would be delighted, or get me to speak to any groups that you are able to organize. As for Jasser appearing, he offers hope to a certain portion of the conservative public, because he doesn't speak to anybody else, to the conservative public, that Islam is basically okay, just get rid of Islamism and political Islam. That, of course, is false. It's essentially a lie, because political Islam and Islamism, as you know, come from the Quran just like the rest of Islam does. But Jasser won't tell you that. But by raising these false hopes in people, he divides the conservative community and prevents us from taking a stand against our true enemy, which comes from the Quran. And any Muslims who follow the Quran are necessarily our enemies because their God tells them to be that. It's a serious situation. There are some people on our side who understand this, and they have called Dr. Jasser very, very dangerous, because he raises these false hopes which prevent us from taking action against our enemies. In order to deal with our enemies, we have to define the enemy first and foremost. If we can't define the enemy, we can't defend ourselves. Oh, all these questions. Yes, ma'am? A little louder, please. Did everybody hear that? No. Essentially, it has to do with deception. That in order to spread Islam, Muslims are actually required to deceive non-Muslims. Sometimes that means pretending to be moderates when in fact they're not, like CARE pretends to be moderate. The various Muslim Brotherhood front organizations in the United States pretend to be moderate. They're not, because they share the same goals as the others. So this is taqiyya, and there are other versions of lying in that Muslim, the Islamic Sharia manual, Reliance of the Traveler. There's a whole chapter on permissible lying, where they define different types of lying, which is all permissible. It's not permissible if you're doing it for selfish reasons. It is permissible and even required if there's no other way to achieve the strengthening of the Islamic community. That's first and foremost, strengthening the Islamic community. If it takes lying to do that, then you have to lie. This raises the question, what about Muslim spokesmen? There are lots of them, not just from CARE. In my own personal opinion, never, ever trust a Muslim spokesman any more than you would trust an employee of Philip Morris to tell you the truth about tobacco smoking. They won't do it. Their purpose is to promote Islam, and they will tell you what they want you to know in order to promote Islam. If you want the truth about Islam, don't go to a Muslim spokesman. Go to the sources. Go to the Quran. Go to the statements of Muhammad, and go to the most respected Islamic religious authorities, like Qaradawi and many others. They will tell the truth about Islam because they're not talking to us. They're telling other Muslims how they're supposed to be good Muslims. So you can rely on them to tell the truth about Islam.